The courtroom went quiet the moment I pushed open the heavy oak door, not the polite kind of quiet that settles before a judge enters. This was different. This was the kind of silence that ripples outward from a single point like a stone dropped into still water, spreading from the bailiff near the door, to the clerk at her desk, to the rows of strangers in the gallery, until it reached the two people sitting at the plaintiff's table who hadn't seen me in 4 years. My father turned first. His mouth was already curved into that familiar half-smile he always wore when he thought he'd already won something. When his eyes landed on me, on the uniform, on the gold wings above my left breast pocket, on the ribbons stacked 4 rows high, the smile didn't disappear. It shifted. It became something smaller and confused. The expression of a man trying to recalculate a math problem he thought he'd already solved. My mother didn't smile. She looked at me the way she always had when I did something she couldn't categorize, head tilted slightly, lips pressed together, eyes moving slowly from my cover to my shoes and back up again. Then she shook her head. Just once. Barely perceptible. The same gesture she'd made the morning I left for basic training at 18. Standing on the front porch of the house in Clarksville, Tennessee, watching me load my duffel into a cab without offering to help. I walked to the defendant's table and set my cover down in front of me. My attorney, Mr. Whitfield, a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and the steady hands of someone who had been doing this for decades, leaned toward me slightly. "Right on time," he murmured. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Okafor, according to the placard, had been reviewing something on her bench when I entered. She looked up then. I watched her eyes find the wings, find the ribbons. She didn't freeze, exactly, but there was a pause, a recalibration. She set her pen down very carefully. I took my seat. "My name is Rachel Mercer. I am 31 years old. For the past 9 years, I have served as a naval flight officer in the United States Navy, most recently attached to a carrier air wing with 2 combat deployments to the Middle East. I hold the rank of lieutenant commander. I have been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Among other commendations I don't often talk about at dinner parties, which is fine, because I am not invited to many. The lawsuit on the table that morning concerned my grandfather's property in Hartwell, Georgia, 14 acres on the western bank of Lake Hartwell, including the house he built in 1974, a detached workshop, and a small dock that he and I had repaired together the summer I was 12. My grandfather, Gerald Mercer, had passed 8 months earlier. He had left the property to me in a will dated 3 years before his death, witnessed and notarized, reviewed by 2 separate estate attorneys, and filed with the county clerk in Hart County. My parents were contesting it. Their argument, as laid out in the filings I'd read on a laptop in a hotel room in Bahrain 2 months earlier, was that my grandfather had been of diminished capacity when the will was amended, that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly man, that the property, which had appreciated significantly since the lake development projects of the early 2010s, rightfully belonged to the family as a whole, meaning, in practical terms, to them. There was also a second argument, smaller and uglier, tucked into paragraph 7 of their filing. It suggested that because I had been largely absent from my grandfather's life due to my military service, I had forfeited any moral claim to his legacy, that I had chosen the Navy over my family, and that choice should have consequences. I had read that paragraph 3 times in that hotel room in Bahrain. Then I had closed the laptop and gone to do my pre-flight checklist for a mission I cannot discuss. When I came back 14 hours later, I opened the laptop again, reread it once more, and forwarded everything to Mr. Whitfield. I should tell you about my grandfather. Gerald Mercer was the son of a sharecropper from Hart County who had never owned land in his life. My grandfather joined the Army at 19, served in Korea, came back to Georgia, worked 30 years at a textile mill, saved every dollar he didn't need to survive, and bought that land on the lake in 1974 for a price that seems almost comical now. He was not a man who talked about feelings or said "I love you" out loud very often. What he did instead was show up. He showed up to every single one of my school events that my parents missed due to their various conflicts and disinterests. He drove 40 minutes each way to watch me play second-chair clarinet in the 5th grade spring concert. He sat in the bleachers at my JROTC drill competitions in high school with a thermos of coffee and a patience that seemed genuinely inexhaustible. When I told him I was going to pursue a commission and flight training, he sat quietly for a moment, then nodded once and said, "Good. You always needed sky." My parents' reaction was less poetic. My father had wanted me to go into business administration. He had a specific vision of what that meant, joining the regional insurance company where he'd spent his career, working under him for a few years, eventually taking over a book of clients he'd built. A legacy, he called it. He used that word a lot. Legacy. As if the 30-year-old term life policies of Central Tennessee constituted something to be passed down through generations. When I chose the Navy instead, he told me I was being selfish, that I was throwing away opportunity, that I would regret it. He said several other things that I am choosing not to repeat here because they are not the point of this story, though I will tell you that my mother stood in the kitchen doorway during that conversation and said nothing, which in its own way said everything. I left for officer candidate school in Pensacola on a Thursday morning. My grandfather drove me to the bus station. He shook my hand when I got out of the truck, which was his way of being formal about something important. Then he said, "Write when you can. I'll be here." He was always there. For 9 years, through 2 deployments, through flight school and qualifications and temporary duty assignments that kept me moving constantly across time zones, he was always there. Letters at first, then emails when he finally learned how, then the occasional video call where he'd hold the laptop too close to his face, and I'd spend half the call looking directly up his nose. He asked about my work without asking for details he knew I couldn't give. He sent newspaper clippings about Lake Hartwell when the water levels changed. He told me about the garden, about the dock, about the family of herons that had nested in the cypress trees along the bank for as long as he could remember. I visited when I could, not as often as I wanted. That is the arithmetic of military service. You are always calculating what you can afford to give to the people and places that matter to you against what the mission requires. It is not a calculation that ever comes out clean. My parents visited the property perhaps twice in the last decade of my grandfather's life. I know this because he told me, matter-of-factly, without complaint, the way he reported most facts that were simply true regardless of how one felt about them. He amended his will 3 years before he died. He called me to tell me. I was in Norfolk at the time, between deployments, and I remember standing in the parking lot of the commissary with groceries in my hand, listening to him explain in his careful, deliberate way that he had thought about it for a long time, and that the land should go to someone who understood what it meant to build something worth keeping. "I'm not giving it to you because I'm angry at anyone," he said. "I'm giving it to you because you're the one who would take care of it." I told him it wasn't necessary. He said he knew it wasn't necessary. He said he was doing it anyway. He died in February, quietly, in the house he had built, which is the way he would have wanted. I was notified while on deployment, and was granted emergency leave to attend the funeral. My parents were there. We did not speak beyond what politeness required. The will was read 6 weeks later. My parents did not take the news well. Standing outside the estate attorney's office that afternoon, in the parking lot of a strip mall in Hartwell, my father told me with the same tone he'd used when I chose the Navy that I had manipulated an old man, that I had spent years working on him from a distance, that it was shameful. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about all the letters, about the dock we'd repaired, about the 5-hour drive I'd made twice on 36-hour leave windows just to sit on that porch and drink coffee with my grandfather while herons walked the shallows. Then I got in my rental car and drove to the property and sat on the dock for a long time. My parents filed suit 2 months later. Mr. Whitfield had been thorough. He had obtained phone records, email correspondence, visitor logs from the assisted living facility my grandfather had briefly used for physical therapy after a hip surgery, records showing that his primary visitors during those months were me, via video call logged by the facility's system, and a neighbor named Doris who brought him casseroles. He had a statement from the notary. He had a statement from the estate attorney who had reviewed the will. He had a statement from my grandfather's physician confirming that Gerald Mercer had been entirely of sound mind at the time the will was amended, and had, in fact, discussed his estate planning with his doctor in the context of ensuring it was completed while his faculties were unquestionable. He also had something else. He had asked me, in our first meeting, to bring my service record and any commendations that spoke to my character. I had told him that seemed unnecessary. He had said, gently but firmly, that he'd been doing this for 35 years, and he would like me to trust him. I trusted him. The plaintiff's attorney, a younger man named Cresswell, who had the slightly overgroomed look of someone very concerned with appearing competent, opened by characterizing me as an absent figure who had used occasional visits and remote communication to manipulate an isolated elderly Sime man. He used the word calculated 3 times in his opening statement. He suggested that my military career, far from being admirable, was evidence of a pattern of self-interest, that I had always prioritized my own ambitions over my family. I sat very still during this. Mr. Whitfield had told me to sit very still. My father watched me from the plaintiff's table with an expression I couldn't entirely read. It might have been satisfaction. It might have been something more complicated than that, the expression of a man who had constructed a story about his daughter over many years and needed that story to hold in order for other things to remain true. My mother did not look at me during the opening statement. She looked at her hands. Mr. Whitfield's opening was brief. He said the evidence would show that the will was valid, that the testator was competent, and that the plaintiff's claims of undue influence were contradicted by every material fact in the record. He said we would let the documentation speak for itself. Then the evidence phase began. It took most of the morning. The notary testified. The estate attorney testified. My grandfather's physician testified via video deposition, speaking slowly and carefully, that Gerald Mercer had been one of his sharpest patients and had specifically told him he wanted the will finalized while nobody could question my head. Mr. Cresswell tried to suggest that my grandfather's affection for me was itself a form of vulnerability, that I had cultivated a close relationship in order to exploit it. The physician looked at him for a moment and then said, "Sir, having someone who loves you is not a cognitive impairment." There was a small sound from the gallery. Judge Okafor did not quite smile, but something shifted in her expression. Then it was my turn. I took the stand and gave my name and rank and service dates. Mr. Whitfield walked me through the timeline of my grandfather's estate planning, through the correspondence, through my visits. He was methodical and quiet about it, like someone laying down cards one at a time, not rushing. Then he asked me to describe my relationship with my grandfather. I had not prepared a speech. I had thought about this moment on the plane from Norfolk, staring at the seat back in front of me, and I had decided I would simply tell the truth in the plainest way I knew how. I said that my grandfather was the person who taught me what it meant to build something that lasted, that he had worked his entire life for a piece of land that he could pass to the next generation, and he had done it without complaining, without asking for recognition, without any expectation that anyone would understand what it had cost him. I said that visiting him, even when visits were short, even when they were video calls at 2 a.m, my time, because of time zone differences, had never felt like an obligation. It had felt like orientation, like checking your instruments and confirming you know where true north is. I said that when I was deployed and things were difficult in ways I couldn't describe to anyone outside of my crew, I would sometimes think about that dock on Lake Hartwell and the way the water looked in the early morning, and it helped. The courtroom was quiet. Mr. Cresswell's cross-examination attempted to establish that the frequency of my calls had increased in the 3 years after the will was amended, suggesting this was evidence that I had gotten what I wanted and then stayed, engaged to protect it. Mr. Whitfield objected, citing the phone records that showed the call frequency had been consistent for 6 years, not increased. The objection was sustained. Then Mr. Whitfield said he had one more piece of documentation to submit. He introduced my service record summary and commendation citations into evidence. Not as a character play, he explained to the judge simply to address the plaintiff's characterization of my career as self-interested and my absences as negligent. Judge Okafor reviewed the documents. I watched her read. I watched the exact moment she reached the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. She looked up at me. "Lieutenant Commander Mercer," she said, and her voice had changed slightly, not unprofessional, but different. "Is this citation referring to the evacuation operation off the coast of Djibouti in 2022? "Yes, ma'am," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I ask because my nephew was stationed at Camp Lemonnier that year. He's mentioned that operation." She paused. "He's mentioned it several times, actually." Mr. Cresswell started to object. Judge Okafor looked at him with an expression that stopped him before he finished the sentence. "I am not making a ruling based on this," she said clearly. "I am noting it for the record because the plaintiff's counsel has spent considerable time this morning characterizing the defendant's military service as evidence of selfishness and absence. I believe the record speaks to a different conclusion." She set the documents down. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." I walked to the side of the room during the recess. Mr. Whitfield stood next to me and said nothing for a moment. Through the tall windows I could see the parking lot, sunlight on asphalt. An ordinary Tuesday in Georgia. "You did well," he said finally. I looked over at the plaintiff's table, where my father was speaking in low tones with Mr. Cresswell. My mother was not part of the conversation. She was sitting slightly apart, her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. As I watched, she glanced over at me. We looked at each other for a moment, just a moment, and then she looked away. I don't know what that look meant. I've thought about it since. I think it was the look of someone who had gotten on a train a long time ago and was only now, somewhere deep in the journey, beginning to wonder about the destination. Judge Okafor ruled that afternoon. She ruled that the will was valid, that Gerald Mercer had been of sound mind and full legal capacity when it was amended, that the plaintiff had presented no credible evidence of undue influence, and had relied instead on characterizations of distance, of absence, of self-interest, that were directly contradicted by the documentary record and by the testimony of multiple witnesses. She noted that military service, by its nature, requires physical absence, that equating absence of physical proximity with absence of relationship was a misunderstanding of how service members maintain bonds with their families and loved ones, that a phone call at 2 a.m. across a 12-hour time difference was not a lesser form of presence, it was a more demanding one. She awarded the property to me. She also awarded legal costs. My father stood up too quickly when the ruling was read, and his chair scraped back loud against the floor. Mr. Cresswell put a hand on his arm. My father shook it off, then seemed to reconsider. Seemed, for the first time in the proceedings, to understand that the thing he had expected to happen was not going to happen, and that the thing that was happening instead was going to remain true regardless of how he felt about it. He looked at me then. Not the smile from the morning that was gone. This was something raw. I held his gaze. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, mostly, and sad in the particular way that comes from watching someone you used to love make themselves into a stranger over many years, one choice at a time. My mother was already gathering her things. She didn't look up. I drove out to the property that evening. It was late April, and the lake was high, glinting silver through the tree line. The house needed work, the gutters were clogged, the porch railing had a soft spot near the steps, the dock needed new planking on the far end. My grandfather had kept up what he could in his last years, but there was a limit to what one person could manage. I stood on the dock for a long time as the light came down over the water. There was a heron standing in the shallows about 30 yards out, absolutely still, the way herons get when they are hunting and time stops mattering. I watched it for a while. It didn't move. The water barely moved. The cypress trees on the far bank held their reflections perfectly. I thought about my grandfather shaking my hand at the bus station in Clarksville 13 years ago. I thought about his voice on the phone from 23,000 feet, routed through satellite uplink, slightly delayed, asking me whether I was eating enough, and whether the weather was interesting, and whether I could see the stars clearly from where I was. I could always see the stars clearly from where I was. I took out my phone and called the only person I wanted to talk to, my crew chief, Petty Officer Daniels, who had been on both my deployments and was currently on leave in South Carolina, 2 hours north. I told him I'd bought a property on a lake, and it needed work, and I would pay him in fish if he wanted to come down on the weekend and help me replace some dock planking. He said he'd be there Saturday morning. I went inside and opened every window to let the lake air move through the rooms. My grandfather's coffee mug was still on the counter. I washed it carefully and put it in the cabinet. I didn't fix everything that night. Some things take time, and time, I have learned, is not something to be rushed when you finally have enough of it. I sat on the porch until it was dark, and then a while after that, the herons settled into the cypress trees with a soft sound of wings. The lake held all the last light for a long moment before it finally let it go. I was home.